I'm Katharine Petkovski. I'm a composer from Mississauga, Ontario. I currently live in Toronto. I went to the University of Toronto for my undergrad and my master's, and I am a triple Libra. So that's all you need to know.
What's a triple Libra, should I ask?
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. Okay.
That's my fun fact. That's all I've got.
That's the fun fact. Thank you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got into music originally as a child or as an adult, and then how you sort of decided to go into composition?
Certainly. So I was taught piano as a kid by my dad. I have two sisters, so all three of us were actually trained kind of in the classical sense. After that, I went to an art school for my high school where I played piano as my primary instrument. I was an accompanist for several choral ensembles, and I was also in some jazz ensembles. So that's kind of when I started to get more, interested and engaged. And I began composing and producing music at around the same time in my late teens. So I attended the University of Toronto for composition, where I began to gather experience and get more comfortable writing music for performers. I wrote a lot of choral music, as I've always sung in choirs since I was, I guess, in elementary school. I've been singing in choirs for over 10 years and I love it. So when I started writing music for choirs, I really enjoyed that collaborative aspect of it, especially writing for an ensemble I was a member of, because you're able to kind of get feedback in real time. So, if you make a misstep, it's pretty quick. It reveals itself pretty fast. So I really enjoyed doing that. And then I started writing more chamber and orchestral music as I began my master's in music composition at the University of Toronto. And when I think about how I started getting into composing, I guess it was born mostly from a passion for film music. So I've always loved film music. When I was a kid, sometimes I've always been very sensitive, so I would cry a lot when I would listen to music. So I'd be it'd be the Harry Potter credits scrolling, and I would just be sobbing, turn it off. It was a very mixed reaction. So I was always very passionate about film music. And in high school, I listened to the soundtrack for Life of Pi, which was scored by Michael Dana. And that's when I really was wow, this is amazing. I want to do this. So, and I would listen to the soundtrack while I was in French class. So my French really sucks because I was just always with the headphones in. But over the years, while I was kind of completing my academic studies in composition, I've had the opportunity to score music for a number of short films, which I've really enjoyed. And I've also released my own recording projects along the way that could be described as cinematic in style. So I also produce my own music, which has opened a lot of doors for me to work on projects with more people and just get more collaborations and experience. But I love the element of music production as well, because it's one thing to kind of visualize the ideas, and I could kid myself and pretend that I sit at a piano and envision every element. But it's very nice to being able to produce music and having sample sounds, because technology is really amazing these days. You can kind of hear anything in real time. So that's been really helpful and great, just especially in the pandemic when it was so much harder to get performers or anybody to play your music. And that's the least of the problems. That's a first world problem that happened in the pandemic. But that's when I really kind of delved further into music production and spent all my savings on sample packs. So that's, I owe a lot of money. But yeah.
Are any of the projects you mentioned, the short films, available for viewing?
Absolutely. I think some of them, I'm thinking of a couple in particular. There's one called With Love for Munera that I scored in 2020. I believe it was at the TIFF Next Wave Film Festival, and it might be available online for streaming. But it went on to show at a number of festivals. A lot of them were online premieres because it was during the pandemic. But the other film I did recently was Coin Slot, and that might be available for online streaming. It might be linked on my website. I've recently revamped the website, so I threw in all the links to my IMDb stuff. That's probably the hardest part about being a composer, is you feel like your own pimp sometimes. So that's...
Yeah, I think you have to be, because otherwise how are people going to know about your music?
Yeah, exactly. but it's for some reason that's like the bane of my existence is like the and it's such a small thing. It's like formatting the website, but every now and then I'm like, can I just get someone to do this for me? And I'm like, no, you have to do it yourself. So I'm like, okay. But
Maybe someday you'll have a budget for that.
oh, that'd be nice. I even like my headshot, like everything down to that stuff. Like I took that in my mom's backyard, like against a sheet that I taped to the wall. But it came out really nice, so I was like, good job. But it's yeah, it's tough out here.
For
But yeah.
sure, for sure. You mentioned one of your sort of cinematic musical influences when you're talking about getting into film music. Do you have any other musical influences that are really strong?
Yes, I have. Well, I've got a number of musical influences across like a few genres, I would say, as everyone does. I'm heavily influenced by composers like John Tavener, Petrus Vasks, and Max Richter. Um, Specifically, any kind of composers that are more minimal, I guess, in the material they use. I really like repetition in music. I find it very trance-like, and when I'm writing, that's something I do, which sometimes it's a challenge because I'll be like, is this too simple? And then I'm like, no, that's, it's working for me. This is okay. But I also love artists such as Patrick Watson, Feist, Sufjan Stevens, and bands like Fleet Foxes and Arcade Fire. And then recently I found myself really inspired by Agnes Obel and Caroline Shaw. I was actually listening to a lot of Caroline Shaw when I wrote the string quartet that's going to be performed by Untitled Ensemble. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, those are my musical influences, I guess, people influences. And then thematically, I'm very inspired by nature and just like cycles, repetition, those kinds of things.
Super interesting. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the folktale? Excuse my voice. The folktale that inspired your piece. I have the program notes, but I'd love to hear you talk about it a bit.
Oh, yes, I would love to. Okay, so the story basically, when I was beginning my research for the string quartet, I've actually attempted to write string quartets for 2 or 3 years before I managed to churn this one out. Just because I think I got a bit in my head. It was a very daunting thing to me, especially because it's the limited number of voices actually means you feel more naked when you're writing. It's different than if I were writing for a choir where you can kind of rely on certain tricks or chords or features. So I was looking for something that would inspire me. And I, especially being of Macedonian heritage on my dad's side, I was kind of like, without being too gimmicky, maybe I can find, something there that could kind of serve as a starting off point at least. So I was just searching up Macedonian folk tales, and I think this is like one of the. It's not a folk tale that I grew up listening to. I'd never even heard of it, to be honest. But I found it on Google. Thank you, Google. And I was reading about it, and it's a story. So I'll just walk you through the story. The story tells of a brother and a sister, and who, with the help of their mother, escape their household after their father attempts to cook and eat the pair of them. So, just normal family things. And they go to been there. They go to the woods and they manage on their own for a short while, until the brother drinks from a footprint of a deer, and after doing so turns into a deer, it's one of those folkloric things, I guess. I'm like, okay, makes sense. So the sister hides in the forest with him until the king and his army discover the both of them, her hiding in the tree and her brother a deer. So they capture her and proceed to kill and cook her brother for dinner as he's a deer. Back at the castle, the sister says nothing and instead just very silently collects the bones of her brother off her plate. So, kind of a dark tale, pretty cryptic. And the traditional moral of the story, because I was trying to unpack this, I was like, what the hell does this mean? Like, this is okay. But the traditional moral is it's supposed to pertain to family and sacrifice. But to me, I guess what stuck out was the father's actions and kind of trying to consume his children. That interested me the most when I was selecting the story. So the piece is inspired by certain elements of the folk tale, but doesn't follow it strictly, I would say. Because there's some other elements in the story, like about a magic comb and things like that, that I was like, okay, I don't want everything to align perfectly with the story. I just kind of wanted to have that idea. And so I kind of sat down and started brainstorming. on the basis of that. And I have this folk tale that my dad used to play on the piano growing up. It's a Macedonian folk song. And it's kind of a cheerful song, but the theme, like, I'm so familiar with this thing because he would play it all the time, and my sisters and I would like sing along and stuff. So I took that as inspiration in the piece and sort of planted it into the piece and tried to kind of transform that. So the whole piece is kind of a little journey, and it's a very personal piece for me. So I was really enjoyed writing it. Like once I got into it, I was like obsessive, and it was a good thing because pandemic. So I was like nothing else to do, but kind of as a lot of people did probably during the pandemic, a lot of reflective work, a lot of introspection. So the piece is ultimately about acceptance and kind of the cyclic, nonlinear nature of trauma and healing. But that being said, it's not something that is the program notes aren't essential for one to hear the piece. I think it adds interesting context. But for anyone who's listening to it, the journey can mean something different for every person. But I thought it was so cool I love things like this. When I was like writing the piece and I named it, which is this absurdly long title, I was dedicating it, and I dedicated it to my dad because how could I not? And my dad's name, even though his name is Mickey, he changed it. His name was actually Miodrag, which means my sweet dear. So I was kind of like, ooh.
that is a neat coincidence.
It's like, ooh, spooky. So I had to do it. So yeah, that's basically the story of how this was written and all that.